Hi, Lewis Wertz here. This week on the On Land podcast, I welcome veteran water reporter Luke Runyon. Luke covers the Colorado River Basin for public radio station KUNC. His podcast, Thirst Gap, digs into stories that show how water issues can both unite and divide communities throughout the Western U.S. Before covering water at KUNC, Luke covered the agriculture and food beat for 5 years as KUNC's Harvest public media reporter. I'm excited to talk with Luke about the big news in Colorado River politics, the announcement of a grand water savings bargain between California, Arizona, and Nevada that now waits for Bureau of Reclamation review. We'll be right back with my conversation with Luke Runyon after this short break.
The On Land podcast is a production of the Western Landowners Alliance, a nonprofit organization founded and led by landowners. We are committed to sustaining working lands, connected landscapes, and native species. Half of all the land and most of the best habitat in the West is privately owned. So if you care about the future of the American West, now's the time to get to know the Alliance and support private land stewardship. Learn more and join us at westernlandowners.org.
Hi, happy to be joined by Luke Runyon of KUNC, intrepid Colorado River water reporter, to talk to us about what he understands is going on with this new deal that's news broke on Monday, that the Bureau of Reclamation and California, Arizona, and Nevada had reached a deal to conserve, I think, 3 million acre feet of water over the next 3.5 years in response to the Bureau's demand that the states come up with a plan to save water in the Colorado River. But initially that demand was for 2 to 4 million acre feet a year, Luke, and I understand, just from the basic math, that 3 million acre feet over 3.5 years is considerably less than that. Why the difference in the deal that BOR was willing to say, okay, sounds good, let's announce?
I think a lot of it has to do with the wet winter that we just experienced in the Rocky Mountains. Last summer when the Bureau of Reclamation put that charge to the states of, our models are saying that we need 2 to 4 million acre feet of conservation per year over the next few years, a lot of that got wiped away when one wet winter came along. And I think that decreased a lot of the sense of urgency among the people who are negotiating the river, the policymakers, both at the state and federal level. And it opened the door for this more short-term solution that the states have put together right now. And that's that 3 million acre feet over 3 years. And, it's still just a proposal, so it still has to go through a federal review. And the details on how the states actually plan on meeting this goal of 3 million acre feet there's not a lot of detail of how they actually plan to go about doing that, which is kind of standard for a lot of how these agreements come together. It's this big goal, and then, how you get down into the details of how the states actually plan to do this. We don't have a ton of detail on how they actually plan to do it yet.
Okay, well, that does lead into a couple of other questions that I had for you, which one is that, I know that, and in talking with other officials ourselves over the last 3 months, 4 months during the winter, you could feel the tension sort of easing off of their shoulders about the pressure that they were feeling like they were under. And so the wet winter definitely helped there. But in talking to scientists and hydrologists about what the future of the Colorado River looks like, are we in trouble because people are taking it easy right now when really the sense of urgency is just, this is very short-term relief?
The way that the state negotiators have been framing this is we, for the past several years, have been in a full-on emergency crisis mode when it comes to the Colorado River's management. No one was able to think long-term about anything because each year was bringing its own dumpster fire of a crisis that had to be managed immediately. And that was sucking up all the oxygen in the room. And what this deal does, it's not the ender to all of these negotiations. It doesn't permanently reduce anyone's demand for Colorado River water. What it does is it provides a little bit of stability. It provides some certainty to these large states that use the river, California, Arizona, and Nevada. And hopefully it's what actually gets them to 2026, which is when these current managing guidelines for the river expire. But we've heard this talking point before. For past agreements, there was the drought contingency plans, which were passed in 2019. There was the 500 plus plan that was passed a couple of years after that. And these plans were all billed as this is the thing that's actually going to get us to 2026. We're hearing the same talking point now. We're closer to 2026, so the likelihood is higher that, we will actually make it there. But it remains to be seen if this is actually the thing that is going to get the river to that point, because we've heard it before. The models say that this is the amount of conservation that it'll actually take. But if we get a string of dry years again, we could be back in the same situation very quickly.
Thanks. Yeah. I also wonder, you're in Colorado, and this deal is between Arizona, California, and Nevada. And there are 4 other states that share the Colorado River with those, and they're called the Upper Basin states. Colorado is the largest in terms of contributing and taking from the river, but Utah, Wyoming, and New Mexico as well. And I'm wondering if anything you've heard from representatives, negotiators in those states about what this deal means for their own challenges around water savings or their own ambitions.
Yeah, leading into these negotiations, when the federal government put forward this charge of the 2 to 4 million acre feet last summer, the Upper Basin pretty much immediately said, we're not going to be the ones who are solving this particular issue. They were saying, this is a lower basin problem. That's where the most significant volume of water from the Colorado River is used. For a long time, the lower basin was using above and beyond its allocation from the Colorado River. And so the kind of upper basin negotiating tactic from the very beginning was saying, don't look at us to solve this problem. This is really going to be something that's solved at the lower end of the river. And now that this deal has come together, I think that tactic is going to be harder to maintain. I think there's going to be a lot more pressure on upper basin states, upper basin leaders to come up with some sort of hard conservation commitment along the river. It's not going to be good enough to say, this is just a lower basin problem. The lower basin is committing to conservation. So what are we going to get from the upper basin states? Are they going to say the same thing, or are they going to actually be able to step up and commit to reducing their take of the river? What you do hear from upper basin leaders is that they already feel the impact of climate change, that just based on the way that the river's watershed works, they're forced to take cutbacks because there's just not enough water in streams sometimes in order to meet everyone's needs. And to some extent that's true, but I do think the upper basin could commit to a certain amount of conservation. Not every use of water in the upper basin is on a ditch that dries up. There's lots of other uses in the state of Colorado and throughout the rest of the upper basin that could be curbed. It's just that the upper basin leaders haven't felt like that's necessary yet.
This is another question that you hinted at earlier in that there just may not be the detail in the deal, but maybe you could predict or share what some other people are predicting about what do these commitments to cuts over the next to 3 million acre feet of water over the next year mean practically? Like who's saving that water? How are they going to do it? And then, what are the implications, sort of, to use a water pun that gets overused, downstream of that? Like, what does that mean for the rest of us?
So the way that this conservation actually looks is going to vary among those 3 states. So maybe we should start with Nevada. Most of the water use in Nevada is the Las Vegas metro area. Las Vegas has already been a leader when it comes to water conservation, really shrinking the water footprint for the city and the greater metro area. And so when I talked with the general manager of the Southern Nevada Water Authority this week after the news dropped, he said, we're pretty well positioned to take this cut, to leave this water in Lake Mead and not draw on it. Yeah, we might have to double down on, removing more grass, doing some more, large scale conservation programs within the city limits. But he seemed pretty confident that life itself was not going to change a whole lot for the residents of Las Vegas, and that they're going to be able to absorb this cut. California has much more varied use of Colorado River water, agriculture, municipalities, industries. And there, it's going to kind of vary between all of those different users how they go about making this conservation. So one of the big uses is the Los Angeles Metro, the Metropolitan Water District of Southern California. They're looking at switching their supply and drawing more on the State Water Project, which originates in the Sierra Nevada, and foregoing some of the water from the Colorado River. They kind of have a mix of the two sources. And that counts as conservation because they're not taking water from the Colorado River.
And they've had a really heavy winter in the Sierra Nevada this year also, so they're pretty confident that they're going to be okay there.
And so that counts as conservation as well, just not taking the water off the Colorado River, switching to a different supply. They're not going to be compensated for that conservation, whereas some of these other uses are. And then, some of the conservation is going to be direct payments to irrigation districts, to potentially individual farmers, to just not take water. And so that's some of the conservation that's being talked about, like in the Imperial Irrigation District and the Coachella Valley. And, that's pretty straightforward of like, farmer, here's a check. Don't divert water from the Colorado River, and that's it. It stays in Lake Mead, and that's really where all of the focus is on helping Lake Mead. In Arizona, a lot of the conservation is going to be coming from the Central Arizona Project. This is a large canal system that delivers water to the Phoenix and Tucson metro areas, to agriculture, to tribes. And they've already been hit with cutbacks from some of these previous agreements. But some of the money, this $1.2 billion from the Inflation Reduction Act, is going to be going to cities in the Phoenix metro area, to help them use less water. And we're already starting to see some of those commitments come out from some of those individual municipalities of, okay, we're going to leave X amount of water in Lake Mead, not take it in exchange for payments from the federal government.
It sounds like each state sort of makes a commitment, and then they actually don't know yet a lot of where the water's coming from. But in Arizona, there's starting to be some news of, okay, so that if we add up these cities' commitments and this irrigation district's commitments, we're getting closer.
That's right. California still has quite a bit of contracting to do. This is gets way down into the weeds of how all of this works. But the state of California has made this commitment and now has to contract with individual irrigation districts, municipal providers in order to actually make up this conservation and reach that goal.
So that gets at another question that I have always when these big numbers come out, which is how does the accountability? In the lower basin, it's pretty simple because the water has to be let out of Lake Mead.
Yeah, you can measure pretty much where every drop of the Colorado River ends up in the lower basin because it's all coming out of the spigot of Hoover Dam. And the way that the lower basin kind of functions is on these contracts. Sometimes people just refer to all of the users in the lower basin as contractors because that's really how it works. All of these uses have a contract with the Bureau of Reclamation in order to receive the water that that they have the right to. And that's where a lot of the tension between the federal government and the states were coming in the lead up to these negotiations, because the federal government was basically explicitly saying, we have the ability to turn you guys off because we have this giant bucket of water that everyone is so reliant on. We're going to start putting our hand slightly closer to the spigot and threaten to turn it off, or at least turn it down. And that was raising a lot of hackles in the lower basin of, does the federal government actually have the authority to do this? But, that's the big infrastructure project. And they were thinking of limiting the amount of water that the lower basin contractors were getting because things were getting so bad on the river.
Mm-hmm. We were hearing through the negotiations over the last few months that there was a little bit of kind of negotiating brinksmanship around like, all right, we'll just force their hand and then go sort it out in court. And then the go sort it out in court thing, we heard, would just be a disaster. Sort of like the end time scenario would be that like we were having to sort out the Colorado River Compact in court again.
This is always the tension between the states and particularly within the states. You kind of have this push and pull between like, are we a collaborative basin who like we all understand each other's needs and yes, we have our interests and we bring them to the table, or are we a litigious basin that if someone crosses me, do I take them to court? And so that tension kind of plays out in a lot of these negotiations. Mm-hmm. And even in these talks, people were throwing out the possibility of litigation. That's a negotiating tactic too. It's like, give me what I want or I'll sue you. And, it's a strong argument to make because nobody wants to end up in court. And I think it would be bad for everyone to end up in litigation because you're throwing your fate to judges, to people who might not know a whole lot about water or how the Colorado River functions. And there's been plenty of Supreme Court decisions about the Colorado River in the past that some people love and some people hate. I think the way that you hear it from most of the negotiators is that they want to be able to kind of be controlling their own future. And if you start suing each other, you're really taking that option away from yourself and giving it to someone else.
Got it. Back to this 2026 piece. You said for many years now we've had, this will get us 2026. The stories also from Monday all of them concluded with, and negotiations for this 2026 deal start next month. And it's like, okay, but what's that deal going to do? How is that going to change things? Or how could it change things if it went well? And I don't even know what well is.
Yeah, so the 2026 is because in 2007, the states got together. So this would have been 7 years into our current 23-year mega drought. They basically came together and said, oh man, we really need to have a set of rules to manage this river in a way that we've never had to manage it before because we're like approaching a crisis, like our water supplies are taking a hit. So they signed that agreement in 2007 and it expires in 2026. And so that's where some of these agreements along the line have come in, saying like, all right, we need to get to 2026 because that's when the thing that we have right now expires and we got to have new rules. And, really the rules that we have right now don't really take climate change into consideration. They were created without any sort of tribal inclusion in the process. There were a lot of issues with the 2007 managing guidelines, both the process and how they came together and how they work in reality. And so I know that there are different parties in the watershed who want to make some pretty fundamental changes in how the river is managed with the Bureau of Reclamation and among all of the states. And, I think people are feeling a sense of relief in that they can actually have some of these hard conversations without the crisis management playing out in the background, that, this 3 million acre feet should be the thing that gets them to the point where they can have that long-term discussion and start to answer some of these really hard, thorny questions that have been unanswered until this point.
Yeah, we talked with Wade Crowfoot, the California Secretary of Natural Resources, a little more than a month ago, and he was pointing to 2026. Is there a way that they can go to say like, okay, there's only 11.5 million or 12 million acre feet in this river actually now looking forward, so we're going to divide that up instead of the allocations? And then what does that opening that can of worms do to the whole system?
I think, there are people who feel like the compact has some usefulness still, in that it created a basis for agreement, and it is an attempt to divide up the waters of the Colorado River. And people seem more willing these days to toss aside some of the fixed numbers within the Colorado River Compact. And you're seeing that with these agreements that we're talking about, limiting use even though you're legally entitled to it. And I think that'll probably be a focus of the conversation. I don't really know what's going to be in these post-2026 guidelines. I know that some of the states and the two basins are, I'm sure, coming up with their wish lists or their deal breakers right now in terms of what goes into those rules. But, that conversation is just beginning because, like I said, everyone has been putting out fires all over the basin and not really able to come up with those wish lists of what is it that we actually want this river management to look like.
Okay, so we know where you'll be spending your next 3 years, and hopefully It'll be slightly less of a reporting on crises and more digging into what's possible.
Yes, hopefully.
Okay, good. All right. Thanks, Luke. Is there anything that you wished I'd asked you that you were hoping to explain that you haven't had a chance to on the 3.5 minutes that you get on National Public Radio?
We've spent a lot of the conversation talking about this kind of statescraft between all of the varying state interests. But, one thing that gets lost in this conversation is people in the Southwest are feeling water scarcity in real time, and are having to adapt to it in real time. And that's one thing that I really tried to get across in this podcast is, yes, it's great that we focus on all of the politicking that goes on along the watershed. That's important. And I'm glad that conversation exists and the reporting on it happens. But what I wanted to do is really zoom in on people and places that are feeling this pressure right now, whether that's farmers or tribes or city leaders or just residents of the West. And so I hope that comes across as people are listening to the podcast, that there's more to this story than just the statescraft. There's also real people who get caught up in these discussions as well.
Yeah, that's an important reminder, and I think it's great to point people to Thirst Gap as a place to hear those stories, and also want to invite people who within our membership, landowners in the basin, to reach out to us with your stories, because like Luke says, this is a conversation that happens in these ways with the politicking, but has real impacts on people, and so we'd love to hear from you. Yeah, thanks so much again, Luke, for joining us and for all your work covering this critical issue in the West. And well, hopefully we'll get to talk again about this as it progresses.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Thanks again to Luke Runyon for joining me on this podcast today. I really do encourage you to listen to Luke's podcast, Thirst Gap, from KUNC. New episodes are coming out right now, and you can find a link to that show on our show notes page at onland.westernlandowners.org/podcast. Thanks to Zach Altman for editing help and for reading the ads. And thank you to everyone on the growing team here at Western Landowners Alliance for inspiring my curiosity about important and underappreciated issues across the West. See you next time.
The On Land podcast is a production of the Western Landowners Alliance, a nonprofit organization founded and led by landowners. We are committed to sustaining working lands, connected landscapes, and native species. Half of all the land and most of the best habitat in the West is privately owned. So if you care about the future of the American West, now's the time to get to know the Alliance and support private land stewardship. Learn more and join us at westernlandowners.org.